thank you all for making time out of your busy schedules and coming to our event here at the CUNY Graduate Center. Our event titled War Here and Abroad, CUNY and U.S. Empire. It's an event created by various organizations and persons, and we thought we'd organize this event to continue highlighting the connections between a public university and American military and imperialist power. We think that that's a very important and disturbing connection, and we would like to think more about it, analyze it critically, and give it as well a human face. We're going to be hearing from several speakers. The event's going to go for about an hour with speakers, and afterwards we hope to have a discussion, not necessarily a Q&A, but hopefully a discussion and perhaps a conversation about ways forward and what we can do. So we're going to do that, and so we would also like to thank the people and organizations that help us bring this event together. For example, the Center for Place, Culture, and Politics, the Middle East Studies Department, the Acting Project, the Free University NYC, the Critical Palestine Studies Association, and the Graduate Center branch of the International Socialist Organization. Before we get started with our speakers, we're going to have a poem for one of the organizers of this event. We thought we'd hear a poem, I think, to set the tone of the event beyond just political, but also human experience.
This poem is called "Tomorrow the War Will Have a Picnic." This is by Abdul Razak Al-Rubai. Tomorrow the war will have a picnic. Decorate the hospitals with medicines, bandages, and sharp lancets. Tomorrow the war will have a picnic. Dust off the graves and dig fresh ones. War detests the smell of rotting corpses. Wash up with mud, then brush your teeth white so they'll gleam in the darkness of its pompous entourage. Throw fragile joys out of your heart. War has no use for bubbles or balloons. Tomorrow the war will have a picnic. Prepare your bodies for pain, your limbs for amputation. War's affection is heavy-handed. It loves to mess with your body. Tomorrow the war will have a picnic. Abandon delicacy and laughter. War does not like chocolates or kissing in public. These things are not good for the heart of the war, which is having a picnic tomorrow. Empty the salty streams from the faucets of your eyes. The war's blood pressure is high, its arteries hard, so it doesn't like salt in its food or on your cheeks. Tomorrow the war will have a picnic. Break mothers' hearts now, so the force of their tears won't expand. Cracking the crust of the earth, nor sleeping volcanoes erupt inside our chests. Tomorrow the war will have a picnic. Turn off the moon hanging over the roof, so it won't dim the tracers and flares that light up war's path. Let death come in beauty and comfort, soft as a pillow of angel's feathers. Tomorrow the war will have a picnic. Let's close the parks, the gardens, the flowered balconies, to allow it to stroll at its ease. Sweep those big messy clouds from the sky so they won't get airplane wings all wet, and swerve them from precise, pinpointed targets. Tomorrow the war will have a picnic. Plant flowers, for graveyards will grow. And besides, they will cheer up the dead, who will hang in garlands from our necks, awaiting the judgment day. Tomorrow the war will have a picnic. Store water, bread, and air, because the war gets hungry now and then. And if our tender bodies aren't enough to satisfy it, our childish pranks, our innocence, our dreams, it will be compelled to eat the buildings. Bodies sleeping in graves, books, streets, and biscuits. It will be forced to eat unshakable mountains, statues and stones, anything to feed its body of smoke, bullets, and shrapnel. Tomorrow the war will have a picnic. We must go out to meet it. Out of our bedrooms, our schools, barbershops, public libraries, mosques, shelters, 1,000 nights and a night, caves, postcards, fields, graves, trenches, bread bags, soft drink bottles, al-taqidis isharat, toothbrushes, Ibn Malik's Alfiya, Raudat al-Jinan, family trees, cradles, and news bulletins. We have to come out from our skins and our milk names to meet it, and join its parade to the Al-Salam graveyard. Tomorrow the war will have a picnic, abandoned delicacy, laughter, dancing, childhood, women, beds, cups of tea and milk, classroom desks, and what's left of dreams splintered in corners. No more chocolate, no more kissing in public. Things like these are not good for the health of the war, which is having a picnic tomorrow. Thank you.
Just a brief encouragement. People that arrive late to the event are going to maybe be a little shy of making it all the way over here, so maybe we could
do we want to turn this off until Ashley?
move a little bit this way so that people arrive
Or if you
late,
want to leave as a backdrop.
they can get those seats on the edge, please.
I'll briefly introduce you to our speakers today. Faris Al-Ahmad Zwiran. He's an English studies student at the CUNY Graduate Center, and he teaches Arabic at Hunter College. Born and raised in Damascus, Syria, Faris graduated from Damascus University in 2006 and came to the US with a Fulbright scholarship in 2010 and studied at University of Pittsburgh. Our second speaker is Cihan Tekay. She's a cultural anthropology student at the CUNY Graduate Center. Tekay has been active in various social movements in the US and in Turkey, and is a contributor to the Turkish daily Radikal Mashallah News and co-editor of the Turkey page for Jadabiya. Our third speaker is Issa. Issa's writings and translations have appeared in Jadabiya, Banipal, and the Penn World Atlas blog. He is the field organizer for the War Resisters League and has worked with the Palestine Education Project and the Street Vendor Project. Our fourth speaker is David Harvey. He's a distinguished professor of anthropology and geography at the CUNY Graduate Center and director of the Center for Place, Culture, and Politics. He is the author of numerous books, including Rebel Cities, From the Right to the City to the Urban Revolution, The Enigma of Capital and the Crisis of Capitalism, and A Brief History of Neoliberalism. Harvey has been teaching Karl Marx's Capital for nearly 40 years. And our last speaker is Ashley Dawson. He's an English professor at the CUNY Graduate and the College of Staten Island, where he is the department chair. Dawson's written and co-edited works include Dangerous Professors, Academic Freedom and the National Security Campus, and Democracy, States, and the Struggle for Social Justice. Dawson is a member of the Social Text Collective, whose recent collection is Always at War, Economy, Labor, Life, and Blood. Please welcome our speakers.
Thank you, Ulku. As Ulku introduced me, I was born and raised in Syria, and most of what I'm going to talk about is connected to Syria, and clearly because of what's going on now, and it's in the middle of a bloody war, and get to talk about also my personal experience in Syria as I lived there until 2009. So to start with, if you were born and lived in Syria for most of your life, like me, I experienced the militarization, if I can say, of everything: environment, school, TV, press, and public space, and everyday life of every Syrian citizen. So that kind of explain, as I think what's going on now, like why does the war go to a very brutal, violent civil war if we talk about the reasons behind that. So as I grew up in Syria, in school, everything was related to military. You know, literally, they militarized everything related to textbooks, activities, public space. When I say public spaces, personally, I mean any person who's related to the government was a threat to your personal life. On one side, on the other side, you cannot say any kind of talk about everything because he's in a higher position. They control your life. They control everything. So you have to accept that fact. You have to accept your personal life being led by these, you know, soldiers or these leaders who want to design your life in the way you want it. So you cannot get out of this kind of bubble that the government created for you. I remember in middle school, like, quote unquote, was called the national holidays. Like, as a kid, you have to participate in marching around, for example, carrying the leader pictures or saying slogans, pretty much military slogans, just because you have to do it. So that kind of created this kind of personality and mentality in me that there's something wrong in that, right? Like, this is not what I want to do. You know, 11, 12 years old kid growing up in a school in Syria and going to school in Syria that you have to study in a very, you have to act and study and go to school and do all that in a very militarized environment. If we connect that generally to what's going on in Syria right now, you cannot blame, probably it's not right to say you cannot blame Syrians for like what they're doing right now, but if you were raised up in a military environment, you cannot get out of it one way or another. You have, even if you're against it, even if you don't like it, even if you were forced to do it, to some point you have to act like everybody else. Otherwise you wouldn't be accepted, otherwise you would be watched, punished for that. You know, later on, growing up and starting to understand what's going around and how politics work and how things connected to each other. And now if you just let me get out of that a little bit, like my background, I want to talk about the U.S. generally, how any Middle Eastern or Arab citizen in Syria or Egypt and Iraq or anywhere, how do they receive this kind of image of a militarized, or of the U.S. military after the Iraq War. And they have like some ideas that, and some experience that everybody, not everybody, that generally people would look at any American citizen, any white regular American citizen, and I'm saying white because this is how media picture any American citizen in the article. You know, the American hero, the American soldier, the one who's going to save the world, the one going to do all of that. And how is that perceived as an American soldier, even if you're not? If you're just an American person, you travel around the Arab world, that might happen to some of you if you've been there. People would just look at you, even if they don't say it, like you're an American soldier, because you're an American citizen, and because of all what has been happening recently in the Middle East, especially after the Iraq War, and especially now after the Arab Spring and the American part of that. So I have a story, probably some of you know or heard of Professor Christopher Stone, who's was a professor at Hatton College. He teaches Arabic. And he's like very knowledgeable, educated professor. He speaks Arabic better than me. He knows about the Middle East better than me. Somebody grew up there. So he was, this past spring, he was like in Egypt and doing some research, and he was in Cairo. So he had something to do with the American embassy in Cairo, so he went there, and he was stopped by a guy, an Egyptian guy, asking him, where are you from? Then he's like, what are you asking me? It's like, no, tell me where are you from? The moment Stone said, I'm from the US, he got stabbed in his neck. He's still in a bad situation, still trying to get out of it. So what that personally tells me that why would you attack a person just because he's American? He's a professor, he's there to do a research, and he knows about Egypt probably more than that person who's coming. And he loves Egypt, I know, I'm sure of that, more than anybody else. But it's the idea that he saw in Stone an American soldier in Egypt who's interfering in his country, in his social life, and he wanted just to do it just because of that. So why do we have to deal with this? Like, why do we have to deal with the idea, perception that everybody comes from this country, or the West generally goes to Egypt or Syria or Iraq or wherever in the Arab world, would be looked at as Americans? I think most of us know the answer for that. I know how we got into this level, and it's getting worse, and especially now with what's going on in the Arab world, in Syria specifically, Egypt as well. Like seeing. I mean, the public, the public viewer believe like all what's going on is because of the U.S. military, because that would serve the U.S. military. Interesting. How much is that? How true is that? To some extent, not. I mean, but as somebody who comes from there, as somebody who grew up there, I have a lot of people who I personally know who believe in that idea. Believe in this militarization of everything. They would look at, as I said, any American or any British or any European as a soldier because of the history of interfering with their history. So if you connect these two things together, like what is I personally grew up with, and what people are doing right now, I think people reached a level that they believe in these things. They believe like your culture, your public space, your life is militarized to a level that might drive you to do crazy things, like that guy who stabbed Christopher Stone in the neck, almost killed him for nothing, just because he's American. That is what I will have to say. Do you have any questions? This is my part of sharing my international experience. What people think America generally, the Middle East and the Arab world.
We will do the Q&A after these speakers. Our second speaker is Cihan.
I apologize in advance for any incoherence. Someone else is going to speak, and I want to join in the last minute. So I just wanted to talk a little bit. I was asked to talk about Turkey, and given today's theme, I just want to talk a little bit about the context of the Turkey-US relationship, which is a very, I can only do a very brief overview since that's not my area of research, but basically Turkey and US have had a strategic alliance for a long time, and Turkey is one of the most important, has been one of the most important U.S. allies in the Middle East and during the Cold War, which is
Is this better?
Thank you.
So I was saying, I was asked to speak on Turkey, and I'm just going to do a brief overview of Turkey-US relations today, which I'm sorry if I make any mistakes, it's going to be very brief. The Turkey-US relationship has been cultivated for a long time, especially political and military relationship between, and I guess started around World War II, during World War II when Turkey joined the Allies, around 42, and then Turkey became a strategic ally for the US around the Cold War. In 52, Turkey joined NATO after participating in the Korean War, sending troops to the Korean War. So throughout, I guess, since early 40s, Turkey has been a very important ally for the US, given its geopolitical position, both in the Cold War and in the Middle East, starting with the, I guess, first Iraq War. The legacy of NATO and by way of, I guess, US strategic allyship for the US it still lives today. One of the biggest consequences was a NATO stay-behind operation, which existed in many countries, but the Turkish one has been the most difficult to sort of finish, and there are still actually ongoing trials to investigate the role of what we call deep state or Gladio in the Turkish political realm. So with the start of the Cold War and sort of the Turkey's allyship with the US, communism became a threat in Turkey since the Soviets became a threat. So pretty much like the Red Scare here, a lot of anti-communist propaganda, but simultaneously the US sort of aided Turkey's transition from a single-party democracy to a multiple-party parliamentarian democracy, which resulted in and along with the military coup in '61, it resulted in somewhat improved labor laws which allowed worker strikes. So by 1968, Turkey had a vibrant student movement in the universities, and which was hand in hand with the workers' movement. So massive student strikes and worker strikes sort of characterized Turkey's urban life throughout the 60s and 70s. And this sort of had big consequences, especially because it was the height of the Cold War and the state's need to control both sort of, or not need, but want to control the student movement and workers' movement and the repercussions of this. And the first socialist party that was legal, actually was legalized, was joined to the election. So there was ongoing negotiations, and those negotiations kind of ended with a military coup, unfortunately, in 1980, which is the bloodiest coup in Turkey's history. And there are speculations about NATO's stay-behind operation role in the school, which is a very familiar story for many countries around the globe, which are we consider peripheral or depending on their allyships with the US and NATO. So after the military coup d'etat, Turkey sort of was embarked on a path to neoliberalization and transitioned from a closed, protectionist, capitalist economy from a welfare state to a neoliberal state, or started transitioning, and that kind of culminated in the protests of the summer around Gezi Park, which some of you might have heard about. Simultaneously, an open war started between Kurdistan Workers' Party, the PKK, and the Turkish military, which kind of gave a new meaning to mandatory conscription in Turkey, which still exists. So all males, all men, are supposed to join the military for between 6 to 18 months of their life. If they're out of high school and they're not going to college, that's when they go. If not, they go after their university education. They can delay it, etc. But eventually, everyone has to serve, and that's been the case since 1927. But with the guerrilla warfare in the 80s and its height in the 90s, it became a major issue for your average Turkish man, because sort of conscription, instead of being sort of this the myth of national unity around male conscription, started to be broken when people realized they have to go fight in an actual war. And also growing up in Turkey, I'm also not a stranger to the militarization of life, as you were talking about, in school and everywhere, really. Like sort of very, you grow up like singing marches and doing drills in school, etc. And that sort of affects, covers all the people who are not heterosexual men and are exposure to the like military political machine and its ways of disciplining. Otherwise, in the 90s, with the height of the war and what we call the dark years, for 2 reasons, because very dark things were happening, like people were disappearing under arrest and disappearing otherwise. There was a very vicious war, not only between the Turkish military and guerrilla, but also between sort of the civilians the Kurdish civilians in Turkish Kurdistan and the Turkish military. Sort of anarchist conscientious objection movement started to grow, and people actually for the first time, even though there were very few, started refusing joining the draft, joining the military. So, but conscientious objection is still not recognized in Turkey. So what happens to objectors, which are growing in numbers and have grown a lot throughout the 2000s in numbers, is that you are a draft evader. So that means that they arrest you, and then they tell you to go report yourself, and then you don't. So a few months will pass by and they arrest you again, etc. The repercussions of being a draft evader, it's also what we call a civilian death, because you can't get jobs, you can't get married. Like any official business that you have to do after you receive your draft papers, unless you go and serve, are not going to be done. So you become sort of a non-person. And a lot of the times, since conscientious objection is not recognized, it's not a crime, but usually when people declare their conscientious objection, it will be considered a crime because they will say things that are in the law defined as anti-Turkish or anti-nationalist, and thus sort of kind of like inciting people to riot or inciting people to whatever. You have similar things here. So basically that was going on in the 90s, and then the 2000s sort of saw the Iraq War, and which was for the first time saw sort of major protests in Turkey that was against a US war since the 70s. Actually, that was also not the first time the relationship between US and Turkey soured, but also in 2003 when the parliament overturned a proposal by the US to use Turkish, because there's a air base in Egypt, Turkish airspace and the ground space, I guess, to go into Iraq. So American troops were going to pass through Turkey, and the parliament had to overturn it because the protests were sort of too overwhelming. The consequences would be too big domestically. So that's for the first time, even though the military disagreed with it, or the military higher-ups, and the prime minister disagreed with it, that was the first time that sort of Turkey stood up to the US in terms of being part of its war in the Middle East. Otherwise, we've joined the war on terror. Turkey and the US agree on who's the terrorists, which organizations are supposed to be on it. And then this all sort of gives context, I hope, for what happened this summer with Gezi, because even though the 2000s saw what we call like what people have called maybe the demilitarization of politics, which was a consequence of neoliberalism in Turkey, and a consequences of social political dynamics that I don't have time to go into. But basically certain organizations which had military organizations which had direct hand in the politics in Turkey were dissolved. But instead of demilitarization, that meant actually the direct control of military politics was passed to the conservative and neoliberal government instead of the other way around, is the sum up to it. So now there's a peace process going on in Turkey, which kind of every day changes what's going to happen. Also, one thing, if you're interested to look into, is the 2008 Turkish invasion of northern Iraq, which also changed the relationship between the Turkey and US for a while. And the peace process is ongoing. If you want to find out more about it, it's hard to sort of follow everything without context, but as they mentioned, I work as a co-editor, volunteer as a co-editor for the Aliyah, where we have a Turkey page, and we try to cover the peace process. And I don't know enough to speak about this, but of course now one of the main topics is the massive number of Syrian refugees in Turkey and their relationships with the civilian population in Turkey, who are developing this massive xenophobia because they feel like the resources that are being taken away from them because of neoliberalization are being now directed to the refugees. So things are getting really complicated both on the ground and also politically between Turkey and Syria. As you know, Turkey is sponsoring some of the FSA, or there are allegations that it's openly supporting the FSA, but they're also conflicted, sort of conflict of interest for Turkey is as Syria has a massive Kurdish population, and so does Iraq. So sort of Turkey is again becoming an important key player and US ally, but also the 2000s sort of saw a rift between US and Turkey relationships because Turkey's interests start conflicting with US interests in the area, but not so much that the relationship has cracked, and Turkey definitely benefited both monetarily and in terms of its own war and terror, like from this U.S. strategic relationship throughout the years. So if you have questions, I can answer them. So this was a brief overview.
Thank you, Cihan. Remind y'all, my name is Ali Issa. I'm the National Field Organizer for War Resisters League, whose one of their slogans is resisting the war at home and abroad since 1923. So it seemed like a fitting event to participate in. I'm also the co-coordinator of the War Resisters League's Facing Tear Gas campaign, which tries to use tear gas as a window into the broader process of domestic U.S. militarization as well as kind of support for global militarization. But before I talk about what's happening domestically with the militarization of the police and everyday life and how that relates to, I think, a vast potential for movement building against that militarization as well as alliance building between existing groups, I want to give you two quotes that might illuminate us a little. So in January 2012, we helped organize an event that was the first year anniversary of the Egyptian Revolution, during which we had a speaker that was working on Stop and Frisk here in New York City named Jamel Mims. And in describing Stop and Frisk, as well as kind of police tactics more generally in the US, he called them the counterinsurgency before the insurgency. So we'll maybe dig into that a little more shortly. I also want to give you a quote from a market researcher that's, I guess, very respected in that world called Vision Gain, who said that the Arab Spring uprisings stand to help drive some of the strongest growth rates in homeland security spending in emerging markets over the next 10 years. Why might that be? What is the state of U.S. policing now? Maybe I could just give you a few snapshots to explore that. In 1980, there were 3,000 SWAT raids in all of that year. Right now, in 2012, there were 40,000.
Wow.
Right? So it's a skyrocketing of that tactic of SWAT raids, which gets to about 100 a day. What do these police forces use when they go on SWAT raids? They use a lot of military hardware which was explicitly designed for foreign intervention. So armored personnel carriers, like such as Bearcat, which maybe y'all have heard of, they use them in Iraq as well as Afghanistan. They're now in 90 of the 100 largest cities in the US. And not just the large cities though. Last month there was a report that Keene, New Hampshire, population 20,000, acquired one of these armored personnel carriers, right? So it's really becoming an extremely common phenomenon for even relatively small police departments to have these types of weapons. Not just armored personnel carriers, but you know, certain kinds of assault rifles, right? Crowd control devices, and the list goes on. Where do they learn these tactics or make connections with these weapons companies? Well, a consulting firm called the Citel Group, for now about 8 years, has organized an event called Urban Shield. And Urban Shield is very close to our work because we actually visited Urban Shield this past October 25th in Oakland, and I can talk about that. But Urban Shield is basically a convergence of national police agencies, as well as international ones, where they train and work on mastering these new weapons that they're acquiring, as well as kind of a meet and greet, right? Like how they can coordinate nationally. And there's an initiative called the Urban Area Securities Initiative, which is actually going to have a meeting in Philadelphia this coming May, and these numbers of convergences are increasing more and more. So that kind of talks about the tactics, the hardware, the ideas and the gatherings, but there's also this question of normalization, which I think y'all talked about very eloquently, where somehow non-military aspects of life or non-military companies, let's say, are beginning to interact directly with the Pentagon or weapons manufacturers. So a good example of that, especially considering where we are, is something called the Institute for Non-Lethal Defense Technologies in Penn State. This was founded in 1998, and its explicit mission is to create language for help with the PR on and do the deep, complex research that's required for this process of militarization. So we might wonder and ask, how is the CUNY system or New York area schools involved in this really, really profitable market now? Finally, there's things that are really not military at all that are directly connected to this process now. So for instance, there's a bike company that we discovered is making police patrol bikes for police departments on the West Coast called Kona bikes. There's telecommunications companies, of course, that are helping with surveillance. There's college campuses more and more that actually host and sponsor some of these gatherings. So this process is becoming normalized, but let's explore that a little more and try to understand how that happened. So historically, I think we could say that in the US, militarization is both new and not new. And here I have a lovely infographic, which I wish was larger, but it tries to show some of the laws that have been evolving over the past 100 years that have got us to where we are today. So a lot of this process can be traced directly to the Reagan era and some of the neoliberal processes also that have been happening in the US, and we should explore why. But the war on drugs was key in expanding the weapons, the tactics, and the thinking that go along with the militarization of the police. So in '86, Ronald Reagan declares drugs are a national security threat. National security, we must pull military might to face it. In 1997, the National Defense Authorization Act passes, which means that there's direct transfer from the Pentagon's war chest to police departments for free. So it's not a question of, oh, these police departments are now investing in this. The Pentagon is just carrying weapons, sometimes that are left over from a conflict or the mass surplus that's built up in preparation for these occupations, and giving them to police departments. So we ask why this small New Hampshire town has armored personnel carriers. It's because the Pentagon gave it to them. And the deeper question might be why that's attractive to small police departments, right? Like, what are they getting out of having this kind of like militarized culture within their department? One more, I think, important example of that too is, like I was saying, these non-lethal weapons companies. So a good example of that is mace. Are you familiar with mace? Not the pepper spray, but the company. It's actually a company which makes pepper spray. So about 2 months ago, Mace went to lobby Capitol Hill so that school guards in high schools can carry mace, because they argued that we need to control, unruly high school students, and a good way to do that, rather than hire extra security guards, is arm them with chemical weapons. Right, so you see that these companies are going directly to the government and pushing this process, which is already, in a very high gear. Let me now describe as a case study the action we did at Urban Shield, and hopefully some of the more hopeful aspects of it, because this has been a pretty dark panel so far. So, like I said, Urban Shield has been going on for several years. Why they chose to do it in Oakland, I think, is worth exploring, because Oakland has such a history of resistance to police violence and resistance in general. But we were drawn to Urban Shield because one of the main sponsors was Safariland. And Safariland is one of the major tear gas manufacturers in the world. They make many other terrible weapons, but that's our window, like we said. They've shipped tear gas to Oakland, Bahrain, Quebec, Istanbul, Mexico City, and St. Paul, Minnesota. So we saw that they were sponsoring it, and then this was an excellent example of what we were saying about the process of militarization. So we started to contact local groups in the Bay Area, and within a couple months, this was about a month before the action itself, 30 different organizations in the Bay Area had supported our action against Urban Shield. Cop Watch Berkeley, Palestine Youth Movement, Malcolm X Grassroots Movement, Arab Resource Organizing Center, Allen Temple Baptist Church, Queer Insurrection, Black Alliance for Just Immigration. The list goes on. But the point there is you could see how incredibly diverse the organizations that wanted to oppose Urban Shield are, and how profound the potential is to face something like this, right? The militarization is extremely unpopular. And when people discover that it's happening in their area, they immediately want to oppose it. Urban Shield was on October 25th. 1 week later, they had another Urban Shield because it's in Austin. It's expanding into the Midwest as well. They had it in Fort Worth, Dallas area. And we had only discovered their organizing against that after it happened, but organically, about 15 people got together, went to the city council and said, no, we don't want to have this happen here. We don't want people raiding our homes. We don't want this militarized culture happening. So naturally, people are seeing this as a problem, and I think the real challenge that we have is tying it to the history of police violence, right? Because militarization is, these armored personnel carriers, it's these companies, but it's also a state of mind, right? It's the police believe that they are basically there to hold down a community, pacify it, and prevent its resistance. And where it's been going on in black communities, right, in West Oakland, elsewhere, those are the people that have the experience to really lead a movement against it. So I think that helps us imagine how a struggle against militarism is an anti-racist struggle, but it's also one that is necessarily cross-movement, which has great potential to revolutionize the anti-war movement and organizing in the US now.
I wish I could be a pacifist, but I'm not. I wish I could be an advocate of non-violence, but I can't. I wish I could be in favor of total demilitarization, but I can't. Yet I think there's a very crucial role to be played, as has happened historically during the Vietnam War and many other times, when actually an anti-war movement and an anti-militarism movement can have a very significant impact upon politics. And I think this is one of them. It's not a moment. I think it's an era where, probably more than anything else, we need a very strong anti-war demilitarization movement, even as we recognize that there are complicated reasons why we might take that position, even though we are not pacifists, not necessarily advocates of non-violence or advocates of total demilitarization. What struck me, I think, however, is that when you look at the experience of anti-war movements, the experience of Vietnam was, I think, very significant because it wasn't simply anti-war, it was also against an imperialist war. And in order to be anti-war, you really had to be anti-imperialist. And so it actually was a learning process where you went from simply thinking about war to thinking about the context in which the war was being waged, and in some instances, of course, about how the war was being waged. I was immensely impressed on February the 15th, 2003, when millions of people all over the world, maybe 200 cities around the world, actually ended up with occupying the streets, making the argument that there should be no war against Iraq. This was an incredible moment. But it also tells you something else, because while there were about 2 million people on the streets of Madrid and Barcelona and millions in London and God knows how many people tried to get out here, we never knew because Bloomberg had said there could be no march and nobody could get onto First Avenue where we were allowed to stand, and everybody got stuck on Second, and some people got arrested on Third because they couldn't move. But this was a remarkable moment, but the other thing that was remarkable about it was how it then completely disappeared. And this is also, I think, something that needs to be reflected upon as to what the political coherence is of an anti-war movement, and to what degree can it be sustained? And if so, what are the threads that sustain it, bind it together into a political force that can actually help change the world? Now, I would argue that this is an important movement only insofar as it can name its context. I actually think there is some way in which you can take up the Catholic notion that there is such a thing as a just war. And I'd like to point out that even people like Herbert Marcuse participated in the Office of Strategic Services in World War II on the grounds that the fascism that was being fought was so heinous in what it was about and what it was doing that it required, as it were, a united front in which you would drop some of your own particular kind of politics because the nature of the enemy was such that you needed to participate in violent action and you needed to participate in a military struggle in an active kind of way. I mention that because I think it's always dangerous, from my perspective, that we have absolute determinations. Thou shalt not do that, full stop. And I think the context then is very significant. And the context, or the series of contexts that lead me to support anti-war positions and anti-militarism positions are roughly these. First, all along, war has been big business. And to go after war means to go after big business. And since I don't like big business, for obvious socialist reasons, I think that that context in which the perpetuation of war is actually in the interest of big business, and that therefore political actions take place which are there simply to provide, as it were, justification for the further expansion of public monies being spent on the military-industrial complex. And we see this happening in all kinds of ways. Back in the 1950s, 1960s, the military-industrial complex, if you want to call it that, drummed up the whole idea that there was a missile gap, a strategic bomber gap, and then another gap, and therefore you would go to Congress and be dubbed unpatriotic and threatening the security of this country if you didn't go along with the military budget, which was constantly escalating. So that war, which should be a last resort, it should be, as once called, sort of diplomacy by other means. War, in fact, became a necessary feature of capitalism at a very moment when there was really no rationale for it. When capitalism was founded on war and worked through war and through 2 world wars, at the end of that you would have said, well, maybe we could go to a world which didn't need war. That was entirely possible. But that would have meant the defunding of the military-industrial complex and the loss of jobs and the loss of corporate power. And in order to maintain that corporate power, and in some instances to maintain the jobs, so in some instances the labour unions were just as much caught up in this as anybody else, in order to maintain all of that, you actually became an advocate of war. You would even stir things up so that wars actually happen. So this is, if you like, one of the fundamental reasons that tie-in between war and what capital accumulation is about, and what the accumulation of wealth and power through for individuals and for corporations who are tied up in this big business, then that seems to me to be a very important reason why we should be intensely critical of warlike activities and warlike declarations. The second reason is that if the armaments industry is a major segment of the economy, and if the armaments industry becomes foundational and fundamental in international trade, then what you do is to start to create a world which is increasingly armed to the teeth. Who benefits from arms races? Well, capitalist corporations. What does the US do with the fact that it's got a peculiar trading relationship with Saudi Arabia? Well, what it does is to sell them very sophisticated military equipment. This again seems to me totally unnecessary in relationship to human wants and needs around the world. Again, it's the context that leads you to say that kind of activity on the part of the war-making complex, that kind of activity is something that should be absolutely abolished on the world stage. It makes no sense in terms of the well-being of populations, and in fact it detracts from the well-being of populations in very significant ways. The third thing is that when people get these armaments, there is the habit, as I think has already been mentioned, there is the habit of wanting to try them out and how to use them. There's some evidence even that the dropping of the atomic bomb on Japan is partly a result of people wanting to see, well, what would happen? And once you have all of the sophisticated equipment, then what's the point of it unless you use it? And so there is a perpetual tendency to take these sophisticated arms and to take all of these instruments of war and start to use them just for the sake of using them. I suspect there's not a single general around who doesn't look at the immense array of armaments open to them and say, God, we haven't really tried that particular combination. Maybe we should find somewhere and, you know, stir up a war somewhere and have a go at it. I'm sure that in part the invasion of Iraq this time around was partly impelled by military considerations of that sort. Not entirely, I'm not arguing that that's all it was about, but that there's always that temptation. And we see this, of course, in the SWAT teams that have been mentioned. We see it in many other arenas. And we see particular incidents then turned into a politics which is precisely about validating and legitimizing many of these interventions in what is happening in civil society, in fact the militarization of civil society. One of the great advantages of what happened on 9/11 is precisely that it allowed the militarization of much of civil society and gave a legitimacy to it, which was, I think, very welcome, at the same time as, of course, it gave a legitimacy to an invasion of Iraq, which had really nothing to do with 9/11. So again, there are good reasons why, when you look at the context, you would argue that by being anti-war, you're going to be anti all of those other elements. In other words, you're not just simply anti-war or anti-militarization, you're anti how the war machine is working, how it's delivering, and you're also anti the particular conditions it creates and the legitimacy it creates for a militarization of much of social life. There's another point here which I think is also significant. It has been the case that war has been a great stimulus to innovation and invention. And it is argued that without that stimulus and without that innovation and without the interventions of the military apparatus in the world of technology and organizational forms, that we would not have the kinds of technologies and organizational forms that we now have. For instance, the internet was a military invention initially. We now all use it. Other military inventions were things like radar and so on. The argument would be that you get there because in wartime there is an urgency. Technical problems have to be solved. You are in a technical competition over who first gets a nuclear device, as happened in World War II. And that technical competition becomes crucial to the advancement of certain forms of knowledge. And it allows vast sums of public money to be spent in the sphere of technological innovation. But notice what the nature of these technological innovations is frequently about. I've mentioned, for example, nuclear stuff. You can mention radar, you can mention other things, some things which have subsequently significant civilian uses. But there are two questions that arise here. First, if innovation is so important, and if public funds are to be spent on the innovation, why do we have to wait for a war to engage in that kind of work? What do we have research universities for? What do we have a lot of think tanks for, if not to actually work on innovations in some form or other, which outside of the realm of war? But the second thing about those innovations is this, that many of them are inherently militaristic in precisely what they do, because they are about control, they are about social control, they are about control of delivery of means of violence. They are therefore biased. And when you think about the potentiality for technological and social and organizational innovations, which are set in an entirely different context to that which occurs during wartime, then you would look at a society which has a completely different evolutionary path in terms of the development of its technological understandings and also its knowledge structures. From the very inception, research universities in the United States were either involved in delivering the kinds of technologies which were advantageous to corporations, or delivering the technologies which were advantageous to big government, including, in a major way, the Defense Department and the military interests. So that the whole technological evolution of capitalism has been very much marked by this warlike basis of technological change. So what I'm doing here is simply saying this, that when we are anti-war or anti-militarization, we're not simply anti the very direct things which we can go after, the use of SWAT teams, the use of pepper sprays and all the rest of it, the use of military tactics of dealing with civil disobedience and the like. We're not simply against those things, we're also against the context which they help to define and the context out of which they arise. And that one of the reasons why I think an anti-war movement so frequently flourishes as it did back in 2003 and then fade away is precisely because it has not made the argument in a contextual enough way to say that, listen, we are against war because this is a vehicle for the perpetuation of social inequality. It is a vehicle for the perpetuation of global inequalities. It is a vehicle of imperialist domination. It is a vehicle of colonial control. It is a vehicle for actually all kinds of other forms of imperialism, like the dollar imperialism that the US engages in, so that the technologies then become, I think, significant in relationship to all of these other struggles. So what I'm arguing for here is not a simple moral argument that says war is wrong, militarization is wrong, violence is wrong. People I know make those arguments, but I don't think you can found a political movement on that argument. To found a political movement, you need to create the contextual understandings as to what it is that we have to change about society as a whole, and understand the role of militarization and of war making in that context. And argue that we want a societal change in general. We want to live in a different kind of world to the one which we've created. We wish to redirect technological dynamism in a different kind of way. We need to reorganize social relations. And in so doing, we have to reorganize technologies and organizational forms, and that means doing away with a lot of what goes on within the war-making machine, within the war-making business, and the war-making psychology that exists around us. So my argument then would be, pay attention to the context. Create a political movement which embraces much of that context very specifically, so that it is not simply I am for or against war, but that I am for or against another kind of society to the one which we currently inhabit. Thanks.
Hi everyone, thanks for coming, and thanks to the organizers for putting together this event. If you want to contact me, that's my email address. As was mentioned in the introduction, I'm chair of the English department at College of Staten Island, so I'm going to be talking specifically about my experience as it comes out of that particular subject position. Last spring, along with all the other chairs at the college, I walked into a general chairs meeting where we found 2 members of the military sitting in full dress regalia, and we were subjected to a PowerPoint presentation about why we should bring ROTC to College of Staten Island. So what we've been doing since then, and which I'm going to try and report to you a little bit about in the time I've got, comes out of that moment. Now, of course, despite the fact that we at Staten Island always lament the fact that we're very isolated from the rest of the city, and sometimes even the rest of the country, we should have known better than to think that we were outside the military-industrial complex. In fact, militarism permeates U.S. culture. This is a quotation from Nick Turse's book, A Complex, where he talks about the military, industrial, entertainment, academic, media, corporate complex. This is something that has both, of course, material facets, but also very strong cultural components, and these things are interwoven with one another. So just to take a couple of examples, Hollywood films like Transformers and like G.I. Joe are produced through a combination between Hollywood studios and the military. Video games like America's Army, one of the top first-person pointer shoot games, are again produced with a lot of backing from the U.S. military, and then are fed back into military training exercises. And then last of all, the U.S. security state has become quite popular since 9/11 in the form of television shows like 24, CSI, which does not refer to College of Staten Island, I'm afraid, although it may come to, and of course Homeland. I don't have a slide for that, but anyway, you know, it's also about the security forces. Now, yeah, also, you know, the academic world is very much caught up here. Senator William Fulbright talked about the military-industrial academic complex as long ago as 1967. Of course, he was sort of building on Eisenhower's warning, but he was also talking about the results of the 1958 National Defense Education Act, which led to the creation of dozens of language and area studies programs, which were all shaped by their Cold War context, focusing on Russia, Latin America, and Southeast Asia, and building area studies knowledge so that the U.S. could manage and intervene in those places. Now, those traditions haven't gone away. Today, U.S. higher education, in many ways, is an arm of the military. A 2002 report by the Association of American Universities argued that 350 colleges and universities conduct Pentagon-funded research. Universities receive more than 60% of defense basic research funding, and the Department of Defense is the third largest federal funder of university research after the National Institutes of Health and the National Science Foundation. I'm sure many of you already know this, but I think it's important just to recall these facts. The AAUP report, again, it's now over 10 years old, but it mentioned that the Department of Defense funds about 60% of federal funding for university-based electrical engineering research, 55% of computer science research, and 41% of metallurgy and metals engineering, and 33% of oceanography. And I'm not sure, I didn't have time to look this up, if any similar studies have been done on CUNY, but I know from being a chair and sitting on the promotions panel at College of Staten Island that a significant number of my colleagues are receiving Department of Defense funding. So this would be something important, I think, for us to research and find out. Now, the military has not just got its tentacles into the research that we do, it also wants to control our students. And I would argue that the ROTC program, which CUNY is now trying to implement or trying to resist, depending on your perspective, is a key site for conflict. Why so? Well, because essentially the U.S. military wants to have a multicultural imperial war machine, and that is about representation, how it wants to appear to the outside world. It doesn't want to appear just as white and middle class, but also because it wants to use the language skills and the cultural knowledge of people of the global majority here in the U.S. against people everywhere else. Why do I say all of this? Well, as many of you I'm sure know, the American Enterprise Institute released a report called Underserved, a case study of the ROTC in New York in 2011. I'm just picking up on a couple of extracts from that report. If you could go a little bit further. The report argues, quote, since the Vietnam War era, ROTC units have shifted to the South and Midwest for economic and cultural reasons. Urban areas have been abandoned in favor of cheaper and larger training sites in rural and suburban America. The result of this shift, an officer caste increasingly detached from civilian society, is precisely what the ROTC was intended to protect against. So you can see here the sort of argument behind the report and its title, Underserved, which suggests that urban areas, and particularly New York City, are underserved. What, of course, it doesn't go into, and this is typical of the way that the military and intelligence forces are representing themselves in general as they come back onto campuses, is the context behind the lack of representation on campuses in the Northeast. And of course, that's a civil rights era, anti-war era ejection of ROTC from campuses. So this is elided very nicely, along with the whole history of military violence in various different places, and intelligence department dirty tricks, assassinations, and torture in various different places, as these places come onto campuses, and then as the campus avatars of these various different programs set up high school branches to try and bring people in at a very, very young age. Now, we can see sort of where the American Enterprise Institute is going and where ROTC would like to go in terms of setting up a multicultural imperialism if we read a little bit further into the report, Underserved. They say, to the detriment of the military's ability to recruit from a diverse and talented segment of America's youth, New York students are not being afforded the same opportunities for military service as students in other regions. So notice what comes after the comma, right? A kind of affirmative action argument about how New York students are not afforded opportunities. But if you look before the comma, interestingly, what you see is a pretty frank admission that the real problem here is the military's inability to recruit students of the global majority in the United States. So it's sort of interesting, and I would argue quite contradictory wedging together of affirmative action arguments as well as a kind of naked admission that they want to recruit students of color. And this kind of aspect of wanting to recruit students of color continues throughout the rest of the report. So it's not just this one sentence. If you look to the next section of the report, they say the absence of ROTC units on urban campuses, especially in the Northeast, prevents the military from, and this is my italics, taking full advantage of their large ethnically diverse populations. And then they say this is particularly true in the case of the City University of New York, the third largest public university system in the country, and the alma mater of nearly half of New York City's college population. So I would argue that this report itself makes clear that CUNY is at an incredibly important point. You know, we're sort of the cutting edge or the leading point of the wedge through which militarization of global majority populations in the US is being carried out today. And then again, this sort of argument about the kind of multicultural imperialism comes out again. One last slide where they say that by overlooking institutions like CUNY, among the top producers of African-American baccalaureates, the military is not accessing minority officers fully reflective of the population. So that kind of quite chillingly bureaucratic language of not accessing minority officers, I think is really important. So what happened at College of Staten Island? Well, the presence of ROTC officers in full uniform back last spring was a product of a process that began at York College, where the Army ROTC program was established in 2012. City College of New York and Medgar Evers College launched their own programs this fall with much ballyhoo. And last April, CUNY Central Administration stated, in fact, that the College of Staten Island plans to offer the program in the future. This was, you know, an explicit quotation. And this kind of top-down ramrodding of militarism, of course, is a huge continuation of many of the other forms of hierarchical imposition of programs, pathways specifically, but also the imposition of a school structure at College of Staten Island, where our previously sort of liberal arts-oriented college structure was broken up, and we now have a business school and a school of health sciences, et cetera, et cetera. None of these things were done with significant faculty input, and it's not quite clear yet exactly who is going to decide whether ROTC is put in place at CSI. So there's no sort of transparency about process as far as I can tell, although the administration has essentially told us that they're listening to our concerns, but they're going to make the final decision. It's not quite clear based on what. So to try and push back against this, we organized a town hall on September 24th. The administration insisted that there had to be balance, which meant they had to have ROTC officers there to make their arguments. They also brought Professor Rishi Raj of CCNY, who is the ROTC program director at CCNY, and also a professor of engineering. And he's also apparently chair of the faculty senate. So one thing that we might try to do is think a little bit about who is involved in faculty senates at various different CUNY campuses and change the composition of those faculty senates. And we're also able to invite folks against militarization and against ROTC, including 2 members of Veterans for Peace and someone from the Yaya Council of Military Recruitment Network. The main contra-arguments that came out in that meeting, and the ROTC folks were there en masse, and they were taking notes on our contra-arguments, so I think it's important to sort of note that they're very much looking at our arguments, recording them, and coming up with their own arguments against our arguments. The arguments that came out had to do with the history of the U.S. military's war crimes since World War II. the U.S. military's deplorable record of sexual assault, which people argued was structural to the violence of U.S. military culture and not something that could be reformed away by bills such as Kristen Gillibrand's one. And also the fact that CUNY's mission is to further critical education, and that military science, as ROTC plans to implement, it is fundamentally different from the kind of critical education which we're trying to give our students. The arguments in favor of ROTC really hinged on the idea, some of the ideas rehearsed in the American Enterprise Institute document, that ROTC offers an opportunity for students who might otherwise be kept out of a great set of upward career mobility possibilities. It provides them with skills for the future, leadership skills that are going to allow them to succeed in life, and it also happens to pay for their education, pay for books, pay for a stipend, etc., etc. And these arguments were quite attractive to students. Of course, this has to do with the way in which CUNY has been underfunded. That has something to do with why our students are such an attractive target of opportunity for ROTC. But I think it also has to do with the kind of cultural appeal, which I tried to show in some of the initial slides, of this kind of idea of leadership and of the military's mission. So we have a lot of work to do to counter these arguments, I think. What are we doing at College of Staten Island? Since that town hall, there's been no forward movement in the ROTC program. CSI President William Fritz informed our institutional planning committee in October that the college has no plans to introduce the ROTC since no department has submitted a proposal to host the program, but we'll see exactly what happens. It could be decided by the administration that it'll be imposed some other way. In addition, one of the things that happened quite recently was in November, there was a Flags for the Fallen event. So, on Veterans Day, 6,700 flags were put out for all of the U.S. servicemen and women who perished since in the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. Of course, no mention was made of Afghani and Iraqi people who have died. So obviously this was a very upsetting display and testified to a broader sort of culture of militarism at CUNY. We have a lot of organizing to do. I would suggest, I'd love to hear people's ideas about this, that it's really imperative to organize with student and veteran groups on campus. One of the proposals at CSI is to revive our War and Peace Studies program, and to do that in conjunction with national groups like the Yaya Network that provide really important resources. If you haven't visited the Yaya Network website, I really encourage you to do so. They have drop-down sections that contain government documents that everyone should see about U.S. militarism and its cost for society, about what recruiters don't tell you, and about alternatives to the military. So I would just conclude by saying it would be really great if we could work to end the U.S. addiction to war where we all live here at CUNY. Thank you.
Okay, thank you to our speakers. Thank you all for coming. Ulku and I will try to moderate.